Valentine's had been messy the year before, but nothing prepared me for the ledger she left open on my kitchen table. It wasn't a love note. It was an Excel file named tripsandtips_2024.xlsx. Rows of dates, places, amounts, and a column titled Discreet. I didn't open it like a jealous fool. I opened it like an investigator who'd just found the smoking gun. $101,400 glared back at me in neat, unforgiving numerals. At first I thought it was a prank, some absurd number scrawled in a fit of spite. Then I scrolled. Hotel bookings in cities I'd never heard she'd visited. Transfers to accounts under other names, lavish gifts that matched photos she'd deleted from her phone the same week. The column labeled client contained a handful of initials and twice a name that matched a man who'd liked every photo of her for months. AM. I didn't react with a shout. I didn't smash the screen. I sat down, opened a new spreadsheet, and began to audit. If she'd been meticulous enough to account for her betrayal, so would I. For months prior, I'd been blaming myself. Not anymore. The numbers showed intent. The receipts showed a pattern. The travel itineraries showed control. I copied every line, every receipt, every bank statement she'd thought to hide. I logged dates and cross-referenced them with her calendar entries. Team dinner, client visit, late work. Those neat little lies aligned like an ugly constellation. I hired a forensic accountant, call it fuel for the righteous, only because I wanted the case airtight. He found what I had, $101,400 of transfers labeled honoraria, consulting, and reimbursement, all routed through shell accounts and an intermediary vendor she'd set up last spring. The vendor's postal address was a mailbox. The vendor's owner had a Gmail and a penchant for late-night naps. She had engineered plausible deniability into every transaction. Once the forensic report arrived, I did the thing people whisper about in bars and in broken marriages. I stopped letting shame guide me and made the betrayal accountable. I called a lawyer. I called the bank's fraud department. I compiled the evidence into 3 neat packets. One for the divorce attorney, one for the bank, and one for the IRS. When I dropped the IRS packet at the post office, I felt no gloating thrill, just the steady chill of rightness. The packet was clinical, spreadsheets with dates, screenshots of transfers, copies of invoices from her vendor, emails where she negotiated percentages, and a timeline showing how her consulting payments tripled the same months she was mysteriously working late. I'd left out melodrama. I had left in the truth. She came home that night expecting dinner, maybe flowers, maybe the usual placid domesticity. I met her at the door with a stack of printed pages and a calmness that felt like a verdict. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice had that practiced softness she used when she needed me to sign off on something. She tried that with me now. It did not work. "It's an audit," I said simply, "of the money you earned outside of what you told me, the expenses you hid, the accounts you used, the gifts you labeled business that weren't. Total, $101,400. I watched the color leave her face in stages, confusion, fear, calculation. "You can't," she began, but I held up the forensic report. "You set up a vendor and laundered money through reimbursements. You traveled on company time and billed a client for personal trips. You used our joint card for deposits you then reimbursed through that vendor. I sent all of this to the people who handle taxes and fraud." My voice was measured. There was no theatricality. I was documenting, not dramatizing. Her eyes shifted to the bracelet on my wrist, to the dinner still cold on the stove. "We can fix this," she whispered. "It was complicated. I mean it. Fix how?" I cut in. "By rewriting bank statements? By asking the IRS to ignore false invoices? Because you made a spreadsheet for this. You anticipated discovery. You built a system so neat you thought it would never be dismantled." Panic pushed into her, sharp animal. She started talking about pressure at work, about a man who'd offered help, about feeling alone and flattered. The explanations came like water from a burst pipe, loud and impossible to catch. Her sorrow sounded rehearsed, the kind you mount when you know the audience is watching. I listened because I wanted to know the shape of her excuses, but I had already delivered the only response that mattered, evidence. The lawyer I'd consulted explained the fallout in clear, unromantic terms. Tax penalties could be severe. Embezzlement investigations could implicate third parties. There was the possibility, remote but real, that civil courts would demand restitution. And the banks would view attempts to hide transactions through shell vendors as fraud. She begged. She offered to repay. She offered to relinquish accounts. She offered apologies that tasted like last-minute bargaining chips. I told her repayment was only one part of a long equation. Our marriage, our finances, our future. The numbers didn't just represent money. They represented a breach of trust so systematic it had required scheduled entries, vendor names, and reconciliation fields. She had arranged her life as if she would never be called to account. In the weeks that followed, the IRS opened a preliminary inquiry. The bank froze the vendor account pending investigation. The company where she worked launched an internal audit. Friends called awkwardly and then stopped calling at all. Rumors have a way of exfoliating social soil until only the hard root remains. I didn't delight in her public unraveling. I took comfort in the mathematical fairness of it. The fact that I had transformed betrayal into something measurable that could be addressed in a courtroom or a collection notice. Revenge, for me, wasn't tearing down her reputation on social media or staging humiliations. It was letting the institutions she'd gamed do their work. She'd use systems to lie. Systems would quietly correct the ledger. When we finally sat across from each other in mediated divorce, she looked smaller in ways numbers can't measure. We split assets. I made sure joint accounts were cleaned. I ensured any shared liability from her hidden transactions was accounted for. I reclaimed what we could, money mislabeled as expense reimbursements, vacation bookings charged to our joint card, and, most importantly, the narrative of my life, no longer footnoted by secrecy. I left the courtroom lighter, but not unscarred. The $101,400 didn't vanish into symbolic currency. It translated into investigations, penalties, and the end of a marriage that had been built on both love and ledger entries. She would pay fines, possibly face legal consequences, and certainly never again be able to pretend her choices were private. Standing outside the courthouse, I realized something. I had not sought to ruin her for the pleasure of it. I had built a path from betrayal to accountability because I believed in structures, tax codes, banking rules, the blunt arithmetic of ledgers. Where intimacy failed, I turned to numbers, and where lies were written in columns, truth would now be audited and tallied. //